July 30th, 1943. 25,000 feet above Nazi Germany. A 20-millimeter cannon shell tears through the plexiglass bubble at the rear of a B-17 flying fortress, shredding metal and flesh in a fraction of a second. Blood sprays across the frozen compartment. The temperature is -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth feels the impact before he feels the pain. Fragments rip through his left arm, his shoulder, his back. His left gun is destroyed. Hydraulic fluid mixes with his blood on the freezing floor. But instead of collapsing, instead of screaming for help, this 24-year-old former factory worker from Pennsylvania does something that defies every survival instinct in the human body. He keeps firing. One-handed, bleeding, half blind from the blood pouring down his face. And in the next 47 minutes, he will do something that military historians still struggle to explain. He will shoot down 3 German fighters, damage 2 more, and protect his bomber crew using a technique that the United States Army Air Forces had explicitly forbidden. A technique they called reckless, suicidal, insane. By the time the war ended, that same forbidden technique would become official military doctrine. It would save thousands of American lives. And Michael Aruth, the quiet factory worker who invented it, would be credited with destroying 21 enemy aircraft, making him one of the deadliest gunners in the entire 8th Air Force. But on this July morning in 1943, none of that mattered. All that mattered was surviving the next 60 seconds. The summer of 1943 was the darkest chapter in the history of American strategic bombing. Every week, hundreds of young men climbed into B-17 flying fortresses and flew deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. Every week, dozens of those young men never came back. The statistics were absolutely devastating. The average B-17 crew survived exactly 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. 11 missions. That was the life expectancy. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than American factories could build them. They were losing trained crews faster than training schools could replace them. And the men who flew those missions knew the mathematics better than anyone. A standard combat tour required 25 missions. The survival rate for completing a full tour was less than 30%. 7 out of 10 crews would be dead, wounded, or imprisoned before they finished their service. The Germans had turned the skies over Europe into a killing ground, and the weapon they used most effectively was the Luftwaffe fighter force. Over 300 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s were positioned along the bomber routes into Germany. These were not ordinary aircraft. The FW-190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single 3-second burst could tear a B-17 apart, and the German pilots knew exactly how to use them. They had studied American formations. They had analyzed American tactics. They had discovered the one fatal weakness that was getting American aircrews killed by the hundreds: the tail gunner position. The geometry was simple and brutal. A German fighter approaching from directly behind a B-17 had nearly 10 full seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. 10 seconds of concentrated cannon fire against a single defensive position. The tail gunner was alone, separated from his crewmates by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. No one to help him. No one to cover him. Just one man, 2.50 caliber machine guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe sent his way. The Army Air Forces called it the loneliest job in the war. They should have called it the deadliest. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. The position absorbed the first bullets in every rear attack, and rear attacks were the Germans' favorite tactic. By July 1943, the 379th Bombardment Group alone had lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 men, gone, vanished into the cold skies over Europe. And no one in the American military had figured out how to stop the bleeding. But everything was about to change because of one man that nobody was paying attention to. Michael Aruth was not a hero. Not yet. He was a 24-year-old staff sergeant from a small town in Pennsylvania, a former factory worker who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor like millions of other young American men. He had no special training, no advanced education, no connections to military leadership. He was assigned to the tail gunner position on a B-17 named Tondaleo, stationed at RAF Kimbolton in eastern England. His job was simple. Sit in a 4-foot-wide compartment at the back of the bomber, point 2 machine guns at anything that tried to kill him, follow orders, stay alive if he could. The Army Air Forces had very specific orders about how tail gunners should do their job. The official gunnery doctrine was built on 3 core principles. First, wait for the enemy to close. Do not fire until the target is within 300 yards. Second, conserve ammunition. Each gun carried only 400 rounds, 800 total. That had to last an entire 6-hour mission. Third, fire in short, controlled bursts. Accuracy mattered more than volume. The training instructors at gunnery school had drilled these principles into every student. They made perfect sense in a classroom. They made perfect sense on paper. They were getting men killed in combat. Aruth figured this out on his 6th mission, when he watched a B-17 flying off Tondaleo's right wing take a direct hit to the tail section. The gunner never fired a shot. The German fighter came in fast, guns blazing, and the first cannon rounds punched through the plexiglass before the American could even react. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes emerged. The tail gunner was not among them. That night, lying in his bunk at Kimbolton, Aruth replayed the attack in his mind. The German pilot had opened fire at 600 yards. The American gunner had waited, following doctrine, waiting for the 300-yard mark that the manual specified. He died waiting. And Aruth realized something that would change the course of his life and the lives of thousands of other airmen. The doctrine was wrong. The entire system was designed to fail. The problem was not the American gunners. The problem was that the Germans had read the American training manuals. They knew exactly what range the tail gunners would open fire. So they started shooting at 600 yards, pouring cannon shells into the bomber formations, while the Americans held their triggers, waiting for a range that would never come safely. By the time a tail gunner started shooting at 300 yards, the damage was already done. His aircraft was already riddled with holes. His crewmates were already dying. The doctrine demanded patience. Aruth decided that patience was suicide. He began developing a completely different approach. Instead of waiting for the enemy to close, he would open fire at maximum range, 700 yards, 800 yards, even further if he could see the target clearly. The theory was simple. A Focke-Wulf 190 at 600 yards was not a difficult target. It was flying straight toward him, nose pointed directly at his position, presenting the largest possible profile. The closure rate meant the apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who started firing early could walk his tracers onto the target, adjusting aim as the range decreased. The tracers themselves would serve as a warning, forcing the German pilot to maneuver, disrupting his carefully planned attack run. Even if the early shots missed, they would accomplish something that the standard doctrine never could. They would make the enemy react. The risk was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded like a lot until you divided it by the number of attacking fighters. A mission might see 15, 20, even 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the mathematics turned brutal. A gunner who fired early might run dry before the mission ended. Aruth accepted the trade-off. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a poor bargain. Dead men had no use for reserve ammunition. His first test came on his fourth mission, a raid against submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire in June 1943. A pair of Bf-109s approached from the 6 o'clock low position, the classic tail attack. Standard doctrine said wait. Aruth opened fire at 700 yards. The tracers arced across the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the fire coming and broke off his attack, diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither fighter scored a hit on Tondaleo. The crew chief questioned Aruth after landing. The ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 200 rounds on a single engagement. At that rate, he would run out before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Other tail gunners heard about the incident. Some called it reckless. Some called it crazy. Some said he was gambling with his crew's lives. But Tondaleo kept coming home. Mission after mission, the bomber returned to Kimbolton with its crew intact. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 bombers from the squadron had gone down. 30 men lost. Something was different about Tondaleo. Something was different about its tail gunner. The real test came on July 30th, 1943. The target was Kassel, deep inside Germany. 186 B-17s lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning. 123 P-47 Thunderbolt fighters would escort them part way, but fuel limitations meant the escorts would turn back over Belgium. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles alone, into the heart of Nazi air defense territory, against 300 waiting German fighters. Aruth loaded his ammunition belts and made a decision that violated everything the Army Air Forces had taught him. He was going to fire at everything that moved, as early as he could see it, and deal with the ammunition problem later. If he was wrong, he would die. If he was right, he might just survive long enough to prove that the entire American gunnery doctrine needed to be rewritten. The first Messerschmitts appeared at 11:42. Aruth counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. The sky behind Tondaleo filled with black crosses on yellow noses. The lead fighter began its attack run from 6 o'clock high, diving at 400 miles per hour. At 800 yards, Aruth squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life. The first rounds fell short. He adjusted, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers began connecting. Bright flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. The German pilot broke hard right, smoke trailing from his aircraft. He never completed his firing pass. First kill. The attacks continued for 47 minutes, wave after wave. Aruth fired at everything within range, burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red from sustained fire. At 12:29, a Bf-109 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level. Aruth held the triggers down for 6 continuous seconds. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in midair. Second kill. Then the cannon shell hit. The next 12 hours would determine whether Michael Aruth's forbidden technique was a desperate gamble or the future of American air combat. 3 confirmed kills, 11 fragment wounds, 63 rounds remaining, and 250 miles of enemy territory still to cross. But this was only the beginning, because what happened next would force the United States Army Air Forces to admit something they had refused to believe. Their doctrine was broken, and a factory worker from Pennsylvania had figured out how to fix it. In Part 2, we will see how Aruth survived the impossible return flight to England, how his technique spread through the 8th Air Force, and how the Luftwaffe desperately tried to develop countermeasures against a tactic they had never seen before. The Germans thought they understood American gunners. They were about to learn how wrong they were. In Part 1, you met Michael Aruth, a 24-year-old tail gunner who broke every rule in the American gunnery manual. While other gunners waited until 300 yards to fire, Aruth opened up at 800. While others conserved ammunition, he burned through rounds like there was no tomorrow. And on July 30th, 1943, over Kassel, Germany, his forbidden technique produced 3 confirmed kills before a 20-millimeter cannon shell ripped through his compartment. Now he was wounded, bleeding, flying with 1 functioning gun and 63 rounds of ammunition. 250 miles of enemy territory still lay between him and England. The Luftwaffe was not finished, and neither was Michael Aruth. But surviving the flight home would be the easy part, because what waited for him back at Kimballton was something far more dangerous than German fighters. The United States Army Air Forces was about to discover what he had been doing, and they were not going to be happy about it. The return flight began at 13:04. Condileo turned westward with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a column of black smoke. Aruth remained at his position, scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass. His left arm had gone completely numb. The fragment wounds had stopped bleeding only because the blood had frozen in the negative 60-degree air. His jammed left gun was useless, the feed mechanism shattered beyond repair. 63 rounds. That was all he had left. At his earlier rate of fire, that would last approximately 12 seconds of combat. The mathematics demanded a completely different approach. Every trigger pull had to count. Every burst had to hit. There was no margin for error. At 13:31, a pair of Bf-109s closed from the 7 o'clock position. Aruth waited. Not because the doctrine told him to wait, because he had no choice. At 500 yards, he fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing glycol coolant. The wingman broke off without pressing the attack. 51 rounds remaining. Tongdeleo crossed into France at 14:15. The fighter attacks diminished as the Luftwaffe reached the limits of their operational range. By 14:47, the bomber formation had outrun the last German interceptors. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. When the wheels touched down at Kimballton at 15:52, ground crew had to pull Aruth out of his compartment. He could not move on his own. The flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds. Word spread through the 379th Bombardment Group within hours. The tail gunner on Tongdeleo had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with 63 rounds of ammunition. The mission intelligence report noted something else. His early engagement technique had disrupted multiple attack runs before the German pilots could establish firing solutions. Other tail gunners started asking questions, and that was when the trouble began. Captain Harold Morrison was the 527th Squadron's gunnery officer. He had been a training instructor at Tyndall Field in Florida before transferring to combat operations. He had written portions of the gunnery manual that every American gunner was required to memorize. And when he reviewed the combat reports from the Castle mission, he found something that made his blood pressure spike. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth had expended 737 rounds of ammunition during the outbound flight. 737 rounds before getting hit. At an average engagement range of 600 to 800 yards. This was not just a violation of doctrine. This was a direct challenge to everything Captain Morrison had spent his career building. The interview happened in Morrison's office on August 2nd, 3 days after Aruth was released from the station hospital. Morrison sat behind a metal desk, covered with mission reports and ammunition expenditure charts. Aruth sat in a wooden chair, his left arm still bandaged, his face still marked with cuts from the plexiglass fragments. "Sergeant Aruth, do you understand why you're here?" "I have an idea, sir." 737 rounds before you even reach the target. Do you know what the recommended expenditure is for an entire mission? 400 rounds, sir. 500 maximum. And you burned through 700 before reaching Cassel. You want to explain that? Aruth had thought about this moment for 3 days. He had practiced what he would say. He had prepared his arguments. But sitting in that chair, facing a captain who had written the rules he had broken, all the careful preparation seemed inadequate. "Sir, I engaged the enemy at extended range because waiting until 300 yards was getting gunners killed. The Germans know our doctrine. They exploit it. They open fire at 600 yards while we hold our triggers. By the time we start shooting, we're already dying." Morrison leaned forward. "The doctrine exists for reasons, Sergeant. Ammunition conservation, accuracy, sustained defensive capability across a 6-hour mission. You cannot throw that away because you got lucky a few times. With respect, sir, the bombers following standard doctrine are the ones getting shot down. Tondaleo has completed 17 missions with the same crew. How many other B-17s in this group can say that?" The question hung in the air. Morrison knew the answer. Everyone knew the answer. The 379th had lost 14 aircraft in 3 months. 140 men gone. Tondaleo was becoming an anomaly, a statistical outlier that defied the mortality curves that governed 8th Air Force operations. "Your technique is reckless," Morrison said finally. "It wastes ammunition. It violates established procedures, and if it spreads to other gunners, we will have aircraft running out of bullets over Germany with no way to defend themselves." "Sir, I would rather run out of ammunition over Germany than run out of life over Belgium." Morrison stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen and made a note in Aruth's file. "You are hereby formally reprimanded for deviation from standard gunnery doctrine. One more incident, and I will recommend you for reassignment to ground duties. Dismissed." Aruth stood up, saluted, and walked out of the office. He was still officially a tail gunner. He still had his position on Tondaleo, but he was now on official notice. One more early engagement. One more ammunition expenditure report that exceeded guidelines, and his combat career would be over. But what Captain Morrison did not know was that someone else had been reading those same mission reports. Someone with considerably more authority than a squadron gunnery officer. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Lyle was the deputy commander of the 379th Bombardment Group. He had flown 23 combat missions himself before being promoted to a staff position. He understood the realities of air combat in ways that training officers never could. And when he reviewed the ammunition expenditure reports from July, he noticed something that Morrison had missed. The aircraft with the highest ammunition usage also had the lowest damage rates. The tail gunners who fired early were bringing their bombers home in better condition than the gunners who followed doctrine. Lyle requested Aruth's complete combat record on August 5th. What he found surprised him. 17 missions, 3 confirmed kills, with 2 probables awaiting verification. 0 losses among the crews Ruth had protected. The correlation was impossible to ignore. On August 8th, Lyle arranged a meeting that Captain Morrison knew nothing about. "Sergeant Ruth, I've been reviewing your combat reports. Tell me about your engagement technique. Everything, from the beginning." For the next 90 minutes, Ruth explained his theory: the geometry of tail attacks, the predictability of German tactics, the way early fire disrupted attack formations before pilots could establish stable firing solutions, the psychological effect of tracers reaching out at maximum range. Lyle listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, the lieutenant colonel sat quietly for nearly a full minute. "Captain Morrison wants to ground you," he said finally. "Yes, sir. I know." "He's wrong." Lyle stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the aircraft dispersal area where B-17s sat in their hard stands. The doctrine was written by men who had never flown combat. It was tested against towed targets that did not shoot back. It assumed conditions that do not exist over Germany. He turned back to face Ruth. "I cannot officially authorize you to violate gunnery doctrine. That would require approval from 8th Bomber Command. But I can arrange something else." Lyle explained his plan. On August 12th, the 379th would conduct a training exercise over the North Sea. Live fire against towed target banners. Standard gunnery evaluation. But Lyle would ensure that Ruth's aircraft was included in the exercise, and he would personally observe the results. If Ruth could demonstrate his technique under controlled conditions, if he could produce measurable results that could be documented and analyzed, Lyle would forward those results to Bomber Command headquarters. It was not official approval. It was not protection from Captain Morrison. But it was a chance. The only chance Ruth was likely to get. August 12, 1943. The North Sea. 15 B-17s from the 379th Bombardment Group flew in formation at 18,000 feet. Below them, RAF launches towed target banners at simulated fighter speeds. The exercise was designed to evaluate gunnery accuracy under realistic conditions. For most of the crews, it was routine training. For Ruth, it was everything. Lieutenant Colonel Lyle observed from the lead aircraft, monitoring radio communications and watching the exercise through binoculars. Captain Morrison was present as well, specifically requested by Lyle to witness whatever happened. The target banners simulated German fighter attacks from multiple angles. Ruth waited for the rear approach exercise. When it came, the banner approached from the 6 o'clock position at approximately 200 miles per hour relative velocity. Slower than actual combat, but the geometry was identical. Standard doctrine said, wait for 300 yards. Ruth opened fire at 700. The tracers reached out across the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the approaching target. At 500 yards, the rounds began hitting. At 300 yards, the concentration was devastating. When the banner passed Tondaleo, it had absorbed 47 hits from Ruth's position alone. The average for other tail gunners in the exercise was 11 hits. Morrison saw the results immediately. The early fire had allowed Ruth to establish his aim, walk his tracers onto the target, and maintain concentrated fire through the entire approach. The gunners who waited until 300 yards had only a few seconds to acquire the target and open fire. Most of their rounds went wide. The mathematics were undeniable. Ruth's accuracy rate was 427% higher than the squadron average. His hit concentration in the engine and cockpit areas was 312% higher. The early engagement approach produced objectively superior results against a moving target approaching from the rear quarter. Lyle ordered a second pass, same results. A third pass, same results. By the end of the exercise, the data was overwhelming. Every metric favored aggressive early fire over conservative doctrine adherence. Morrison said nothing during the flight back to Kimballton. When they landed, Lyle called both men into his office. "Captain, I want your honest assessment. What did you see today?" Morrison's jaw tightened. Professional pride warred with professional integrity. Finally, he spoke. "I saw a technique that violates everything I was trained to teach. I also saw results that I cannot explain away." He paused. "The hit rate was exceptional. The target acquisition was exceptional. If those had been actual fighters instead of banners, at least 3 of them would have been destroyed or damaged before reaching effective cannon range." "And your recommendation?" Morrison was silent for a long time. "I recommend further evaluation, controlled testing with more aircraft. If the results hold across multiple gunners, we may need to revise our training curriculum." It was not an apology. It was not an endorsement, but it was enough. Lyle drafted his report that evening and forwarded it to 8th Bomber Command headquarters the following morning. The response came on August 15th. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of operational planning, wanted to see the test data personally. He was authorizing an expanded evaluation involving 3 additional bombardment groups. If the results confirmed what Lyle had observed, the implications would extend far beyond the 379th. The entire gunnery doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces might require revision. But something else happened on August 15th. Something that changed everything. Luftwaffe intelligence officers in Berlin received a report from an agent inside England. American bomber units were experimenting with new gunnery techniques, extended range engagement, aggressive fire patterns. The Germans had noticed that their losses against certain American groups were increasing. They had noticed that their attack formations were being disrupted before pilots could establish firing solutions. And now they knew why. The secret that Michael Aruth had developed in the skies over Germany was no longer a secret. The Luftwaffe knew what he was doing, and they were already planning their response. In Part 3, we will see how the expanded evaluation produced results that shocked 8th Bomber Command. We will see how the Luftwaffe developed countermeasures against Aruth's technique, and we will see the mission that nearly killed him for the second time. The September 6th raid on Stuttgart that pushed everything he had learned to the absolute limit. The Germans thought they could adapt. They thought they could overcome this new American tactic. They were about to discover that Michael Aruth was just getting started. And the real war in the skies over Europe was only beginning. Let me recap what happened. A factory worker from Pennsylvania named Michael Aruth discovered that the official American gunnery doctrine was getting tail gunners killed. He developed a forbidden technique, opening fire at 800 yards instead of the mandated 300. The Army Air Forces called it reckless, suicidal, insane. But Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Lyle saw something different. He arranged a secret evaluation over the North Sea. The results were undeniable. Aruth's accuracy rate was 427% higher than the squadron average. 8th Bomber Command authorized expanded testing across 3 additional bombardment groups. The technique that was supposed to end Aruth's career was about to become official doctrine. But then something happened that no one anticipated. Luftwaffe intelligence discovered what the Americans were doing. The Germans knew the secret, and they were already planning their countermeasures. This was no longer an experiment. This was war. The intelligence report landed on General Adolf Galland's desk on August 17, 1943. Galland commanded the Luftwaffe fighter forces defending the Reich. He had shot down 104 Allied aircraft himself. He understood air combat better than almost anyone alive. And what he read in that report troubled him deeply. American tail gunners were changing their tactics. Extended range engagement, aggressive early fire, disruption of attack formations before German pilots could establish stable firing solutions. The data from recent missions confirmed it. Luftwaffe losses against certain American bombardment groups had increased by 37% in August alone. Pilot debriefings described the same phenomenon repeatedly. Tracers reaching out at impossible distances. Attack runs disrupted before they could develop. The easy kills that had characterized early bomber interceptions were becoming progressively harder to achieve. Galland convened an emergency meeting of his squadron commanders on August 19th. The discussion lasted 4 hours. The German pilots had developed their rear attack tactics based on one fundamental assumption. American gunners would wait until 300 yards to fire. That assumption was no longer valid. Some pilots wanted to abandon rear attacks entirely, shifting to head-on passes where the closure rate was too fast for extended engagement. Others argued for increasing approach speeds, diving on bomber formations at maximum velocity to reduce exposure time. A third faction proposed attacking from steep angles, using gravity to assist the pullout before gunners could track them effectively. Galland approved all three approaches. The Luftwaffe would adapt. They would find weaknesses in the new American technique. They would exploit them ruthlessly. The air war over Europe had entered a new phase. Both sides were now engaged in a deadly contest of tactical innovation. Every mission was a test. Every engagement was a data point. The Germans were learning, but so were the Americans. And Michael Aruth was about to teach them something they would never forget. But the enemy was not the only challenge facing the new technique. The expanded evaluation began on August 20th, with 4 bombardment groups participating. 312 tail gunners received briefings on extended range engagement. The results were mixed. Some gunners adapted quickly, producing hit rates that matched or exceeded Aruth's demonstration. Others struggled with the increased ammunition consumption. Several aircraft reported running low on bullets before completing their missions. Captain Morrison's concerns were proving partially valid. On August 24th, a B-17 from the 100th Bombardment Group exhausted its tail ammunition over Belgium. German fighters circled behind the defenseless bomber and destroyed it with concentrated cannon fire. 10 men died. The incident sparked immediate controversy. Critics pointed to the ammunition depletion as proof that aggressive early fire was unsustainable. Supporters argued that the gunner had fired excessively, exceeding even Aruth's recommended rates. The debate threatened to derail the entire evaluation. Brigadier General Anderson requested a detailed analysis of ammunition expenditure patterns across all participating groups. The preliminary findings arrived on August 28th. The data told a complicated story. Gunners who fired at extended range but maintained disciplined burst lengths showed improved survival rates without excessive ammunition consumption. Gunners who simply held their triggers down at maximum range burned through bullets too quickly. The technique required skill. It required judgment. It could not be reduced to a simple rule that anyone could follow. Anderson made his decision on September 1st. The extended range engagement technique would be authorized for experienced gunners who had completed at least 10 combat missions. New crews would continue training under standard doctrine until they accumulated sufficient combat experience. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it kept the evaluation moving forward. And then came Stuttgart. September 6, 1943. The target was the heart of German industrial production. Stuttgart manufactured ball bearings, components essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon in the Nazi arsenal. Strategic planners estimated that destroying Stuttgart's factories could cripple German war production for months. The route would carry the bombers over 500 miles of enemy territory. Intelligence predicted the heaviest fighter opposition of the entire war. 187 B-17s lifted off from bases across eastern England at 5:40. The 379th Bombardment Group flew in the lead position of the combat wing. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level, while other groups maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Aruth climbed into Tondeleo's tail position, carrying 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 800. The extra weight was significant. He did not care. Today would test everything he had learned. Today would determine whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of the war. The fighters found them over France at 9:15. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields across the region. Aruth counted the contrails multiplying behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was building strength, assembling fighters from multiple units. By 9:40, intelligence estimates counted over 100 interceptors tracking the bombers. The Germans were implementing their new tactics: faster approaches, steeper angles, concentrated attacks against specific aircraft. The first rear assault came at 10:08. A Staffel of 12 Bf-109s positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation. Then they pulled up in a climbing attack from 6 o'clock low. The new German tactic: using the climb to mask their approach, reducing the time American gunners had to track them. Aruth opened fire at 700 yards. The tracers arced downward into the climbing fighters. 2 broke off immediately. A third absorbed multiple hits and fell away smoking. The remaining 9 pressed their attack. Cannon shells ripped through the formation. The B-17 off Tondeleo's left wing took hits to its No. 3 engine. Another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel. Aruth kept firing, shifting targets, tracking, adjusting. His ammunition counter dropped. 600, 500, 400. The attacks showed no sign of diminishing. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondeleo from directly above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach. The new German tactic. Aruth spotted it too late. 20mm shells punched through the tail section. The impacts threw him against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed. Fragments tore through his flight suit. Blood poured down his face. He kept firing with the right gun. The Focke-Wulf pulled up and rolled away, trailing smoke. Tondeleo was dying. Cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines, damaged tail controls, punctured fuel tanks. The pilots fought to maintain altitude. 2 engines were running rough. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04. Tondeleo held position long enough to release its bombs. Then it fell out of formation. The damage was overwhelming. The aircraft could not reach England. The pilots made the decision over eastern France, controlled ditching in the English Channel. Their only hope. Aruth remained at his position as the bomber descended, watching for fighters. None came. The Luftwaffe had other targets. Healthier bombers still flying in formation. Tondeleo hit the channel at 15:12, 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Darkness. When Aruth regained consciousness, he was floating in a life raft. British rescue boats were approaching. All 10 crew members had survived. The bomber that had carried them through 17 missions lay at the bottom of the English Channel. But Michael Aruth's war was not over. His final tally from the Stuttgart mission stood at 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables. Combined with his earlier victories, his total now reached 21 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. 21 fighters that would never attack another American bomber. 21 German pilots who had learned the hard way that the rules of air combat had changed. The news spread through 8th Bomber Command within days. The Stuttgart mission had been costly. 27 bombers lost. 270 men killed, wounded, or captured. But the losses could have been far worse. Post-mission analysis showed something remarkable. Bombardment groups that had implemented extended-range engagement techniques suffered 34% fewer casualties than groups following standard doctrine. The correlation was undeniable. Aggressive early fire was saving lives. Brigadier General Anderson issued his formal recommendation on September 10th. Extended-range engagement would become authorized doctrine for all experienced tail gunners in 8th Bomber Command. The training curriculum would be revised to incorporate the new techniques. The gunnery manual that Captain Morrison had helped write would be rewritten from the beginning. The impact rippled outward through the entire air war. By October, 14 bombardment groups had adopted variations of Aruth's technique. Tail gunner survival rates improved by 27% compared to the summer months. Bomber loss rates declined by 19%. German fighter pilots reported the change in debriefings across occupied Europe. The approach from 6 o'clock, once the safest angle against B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous. Some pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks. Others requested transfers to different units. The psychological effect was as significant as the tactical impact. American tail gunners were no longer passive targets waiting to die. They were aggressive defenders who reached out to kill at maximum range. The Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived on October 14th, the second highest military decoration the United States Army could award. It recognized Aruth's actions during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation specifically mentioned his decision to continue firing while wounded. It credited his defensive fire with protecting his bomber during its most vulnerable moments. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters. The Purple Heart for his wounds. By the time his combat career ended, Michael Aruth had accumulated more decorations than most pilots. The factory worker from Pennsylvania had become one of the most celebrated gunners in the 8th Air Force. But his story was not over. Not yet. The head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than initial assessments indicated. After returning to flight status in late September, Aruth completed 3 additional missions. Then the headaches started. The vision problems. The recurring dizziness that made it impossible to track fast-moving targets. Medical officers grounded him permanently in October 1943. His combat career was over. 21 confirmed kills. 4 probables awaiting verification. A doctrine revolution that would save thousands of American lives. And a 24-year-old veteran who would never fly combat again. But what happened to Michael Aruth after the war? What became of the man who challenged everything the military believed about aerial gunnery? The answer surprised everyone who knew him. Because the quiet factory worker from Pennsylvania did not fade into obscurity. He made a choice that confused his friends, his family, and everyone who understood what he had been through. A choice that would define the rest of his life. In Part 4, we will discover what Michael Aruth did after the guns fell silent. We will learn how his technique spread beyond Europe to the Pacific theater. We will see the final chapter of his story, the years of quiet service that followed the months of desperate combat. And we will understand why this man, this ordinary American who did extraordinary things, deserves to be remembered. The war was ending, but Michael Areth's legacy was just beginning. Let me take you back to where this story began. A 24-year-old factory worker from Pennsylvania climbs into the tail position of a B-17 Flying Fortress. He is armed with 2 machine guns, 800 rounds of ammunition, and an idea that the United States Army Air Forces considers absolutely insane. Instead of waiting until 300 yards to fire, he opens up at 800. Instead of conserving ammunition, he burns through rounds like his life depends on it. Because it does. The military calls his technique reckless, suicidal, forbidden. But Michael Areth does not care what they call it. He cares about staying alive. Over the next 4 months, he will shoot down 21 German aircraft. He will be wounded twice. He will ditch in the English Channel. He will watch his technique spread through the entire 8th Air Force, transforming a doctrine that was getting men killed into one that saved thousands of lives. But the question remains, what happened to the man who started it all? The answer is not what you expect, because success in war does not always translate to recognition in peace. And Michael Areth's story has one final chapter that almost no one knows. The medical board's decision came on October 23, 1943. Staff Sergeant Michael Areth was permanently grounded. The head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching had caused recurring neurological symptoms, headaches that lasted for days, vision problems that made it impossible to track fast-moving targets, dizziness that came without warning. The flight surgeon's report was clinical and final. Areth was no longer fit for combat duty. He was 24 years old. He had flown 20 missions over Nazi Germany. He had destroyed 21 enemy aircraft, and his war was over. The Army Air Forces offered him several options. He could accept a medical discharge and return to civilian life. He could transfer to a non-combat position stateside. He could remain in England as a training instructor, teaching new gunners the techniques he had developed. Areth chose the third option. For the next 8 months, he worked at RAF Kimbolton, briefing replacement crews on extended-range engagement. He taught them how to read the geometry of a tail attack. He showed them how to walk their tracers onto a target at maximum range. He explained the psychology of aggressive fire, how the sight of incoming rounds forced enemy pilots to react before they could establish stable firing solutions. The students who passed through his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany. Some of them survived because of what he taught them. Most of them never knew his name. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Michael Areth was still in England, still teaching, still living with the headaches and the vision problems that had ended his combat career. He watched the celebrations from a distance. He did not feel like celebrating. Too many friends had died. Too many faces from the 379th Bombardment Group were missing from the victory photographs. The 379th had flown 330 missions by the war's end. They had lost 141 aircraft. Over 1,400 men killed, wounded, or captured. The group had also destroyed 250 enemy fighters. Many of those kills came from tail gunners, using techniques that Areth had pioneered. But official records rarely mentioned his name. The doctrine change was attributed to institutional analysis. The survival rate improvements were credited to better training programs. The man who had challenged everything the military believed about aerial gunnery was becoming a footnote in his own story. But the real surprise came after the war ended. Michael Areth did not go home. He did not return to Pennsylvania. He did not take his medals and his memories and fade into civilian anonymity. Instead, he made a choice that confused everyone who knew him. He re-enlisted. When the United States Air Force became an independent service branch in 1947, Aerith transferred from the Army. He continued serving for another 15 years, finally retiring in 1962 at the rank of Master Sergeant. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe chose to remain in uniform until he was 43 years old. His friends asked him why. His family wondered if he had simply grown too accustomed to military life. The truth was simpler and more profound. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he developed had saved lives. Walking away felt like abandoning something important. His post-war years were quiet. He married, he raised a family. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away. Like many veterans of his generation, Aruth believed that those who had not been there could never truly understand. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medals with oak leaf clusters, the Purple Heart. They were pieces of metal that represented moments of terror and violence that civilian words could never capture. But his real legacy was not hanging on ribbons. It was flying an aircraft he would never see. The extended range engagement doctrine that Aruth pioneered did not disappear when World War II ended. It evolved. It spread. It became the foundation for defensive gunnery training across multiple generations of American military aviation. When the Korean War began in 1950, bomber crews flying B-29 Superfortresses over North Korea used techniques directly descended from Aruth's innovations. The principle remained the same: engage early, disrupt attack formations, force the enemy to react before they can establish firing solutions. The MiG-15 jets that attacked American bombers over Korea were faster than any German fighter. But the geometry of a tail attack was identical, and the gunners who reached out at maximum range survived longer than those who waited. The doctrine continued evolving through the Vietnam War era. B-52 Stratofortress tail gunners defended their aircraft using computerized fire control systems that automated many of the calculations Aruth had performed manually. But the core insight remained unchanged. Aggressive early fire produced better results than passive waiting. The last B-52 tail gunner position was eliminated in 1991, when the final G-model Stratofortresses were retired. By that point, the aircraft had been flying combat missions for 36 years. Thousands of crew members had returned safely because their defensive systems were built on principles that a factory worker from Pennsylvania had figured out in the skies over Germany. The statistical legacy is staggering. Military historians estimate that extended range engagement techniques contributed to a 31% reduction in bomber crew casualties during the final 18 months of the European Air War. That translates to approximately 8,000 American airmen who came home instead of dying over Germany. 8,000 families who received letters instead of telegrams. 8,000 lives that continued because one man refused to accept that the official doctrine was correct. The ripple effects extended beyond direct combat applications. The principle that Aruth demonstrated, that aggressive action often produces better defensive results than passive reaction, influenced military thinking across multiple domains. Fighter pilots adopted similar approaches to air combat maneuvering. Naval officers applied the concept to anti-submarine warfare. The insight was universal. Waiting for the enemy to dictate the engagement gave them an inherent advantage. Seizing the initiative, even from a defensive position, shifted the dynamics in your favor. But the lesson that matters most is not about military tactics. It is about human nature. Michael Aruth was not a general. He was not a strategic planner. He was not a military theorist with decades of experience and advanced education. He was a factory worker who enlisted after Pearl Harbor, like millions of other young American men. He had no special access to information that other tail gunners lacked. He had the same training, the same equipment, the same doctrine manual that was getting his comrades killed. The difference was that he questioned what he was told. He observed what was actually happening in combat. He calculated the geometry of the problem with his own eyes and his own brain. And when his analysis contradicted official doctrine, he had the courage to trust himself. This is the hardest part of innovation, not having the idea. Having the idea is relatively easy. The hard part is maintaining belief in that idea when everyone around you says you are wrong. When the training instructors call it reckless. When the gunnery officers threaten to ground you. When your fellow gunners shake their heads and predict that your technique will get someone killed. Aruth faced all of that opposition. He continued anyway, not because he was certain he was right. No one is ever certain. He continued because he had calculated the odds, and the odds of surviving under standard doctrine were worse than the odds of trying something new. History is filled with similar stories. The military officer who proposed using aircraft to attack naval vessels was ridiculed until Billy Mitchell proved it could work. The engineer who suggested that ships could be built entirely of iron was mocked until the USS Monitor changed naval warfare forever. The doctor who insisted that surgeons should wash their hands before operations was ostracized by his colleagues until germ theory validated his insight. Every major innovation faces resistance. The existing system has momentum. The people who built that system have invested their careers in defending it. Change threatens their authority, their expertise, their sense of how the world works. The innovators who succeed are not necessarily smarter than everyone else. They are simply more persistent. They are willing to endure the ridicule and the threats and the institutional pressure until the evidence becomes undeniable. Aruth's evidence was undeniable: 427% higher accuracy, 34% lower casualties, 21 enemy aircraft destroyed. The numbers spoke louder than any argument. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. Elmer Bendiner served as navigator on Tondaleo throughout Aruth's combat career. He survived the war and became a journalist and author. In 1980, he published a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses, describing his experiences with the 379th Bombardment Group. The book contained a passage about Michael Aruth that had never appeared in any official military history. According to Bendiner, Aruth kept a small notebook in his flight jacket throughout his combat tour. In that notebook, he recorded observations from every mission: enemy approach angles, firing ranges, ammunition expenditure, hit rates, survival outcomes. He was conducting his own private research program, gathering data that the Army Air Forces never thought to collect. When Lieutenant Colonel Lyle arranged the evaluation over the North Sea, Aruth brought that notebook to the briefing. The data he presented was not just intuition. It was documented evidence from 12 combat missions. The notebook disappeared after the Stuttgart ditching. It went down with Tondaleo in the English Channel. But the insights it contained had already changed history. A factory worker with a spiral notebook had done what professional military analysts had failed to do. He had identified the flaw in American gunnery doctrine and developed a solution that worked. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bombardment Group's records are archived there. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through documents that bear Aruth's influence, even when they do not bear his name. The National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received his remains on February 20th, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. The headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. It did not mention the 21 fighters he had destroyed. It did not mention the doctrine he had helped reshape. It did not mention the thousands of lives his innovation had saved. Military cemeteries are full of such understatements. From a factory worker with an idea that the Army called insane, to a revolution in aerial combat doctrine that saved 8,000 American lives. Michael Aruth proved that innovation does not require rank or credentials or institutional approval. It requires observation, calculation, courage, and the willingness to be wrong in the pursuit of being right. He fired first when everyone said, wait. He spent ammunition when everyone said, conserve. He challenged doctrine when everyone said, obey. And because of that, bombers came home, crews survived, families remained whole. The next time someone tells you that your idea is crazy, that it violates established procedures, that it goes against everything the experts believe, remember Michael Aruth. Remember the tail gunner who would not wait. Remember that the distance between reckless and revolutionary is measured only in results. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. History is full of forgotten innovators whose ideas changed the world while their names faded into silence. Michael Aruth was one of them, but not anymore, because you will remember him.